Hello.
Professor Patterson, Professor Rothenberg, Alan, good to see you and thank you for joining us. Now I need to, formally we start at 10, right?
In 7 minutes.
Maria?
Yes.
Yes, we are starting
Okay.
at, but I will asking you if you can be now in silence because the webinar is on live in YouTube now. So you can put your camera off if you wish until 3 minutes before we start, or you can stay there just doing whatever you want. Okay, but we are on live in YouTube. Okay, because we had to prepare everything now. Okay, thank you. I will advise you 3 minutes before we start to make sure we are ready. Thank you. Okay, we are 2 minutes left. If everyone can put the camera on, please. Maria Elena, when I say broadcast, you will need to start speaking, okay?
Okay.
Okay, someone has been connected with the link of Tuan. Hello? Hello, you can't be, no, Tuan, there is another guy here that I don't know who is. Excuse me. Can I have your name, please? Okay. I need you to be out of this panel, please.
William, because Maria, because you send me the link and Maria asked me to send and forward link to our viewer. And,
okay, but he cannot use that link. I can send it to him another link, but he cannot be with that link. So,
oh,
Thomas,
so I misunderstood. I said forward my link to people at.
No. If they use your link, they will be as a panelist. So you cannot share never ever your links. So could you ask him to leave the meeting and go through the registration?
Oh yeah, because he registered already for last event. I think you maybe know already people registered for last event on August 5th. So I forward for my, that is some people, they rejoice.
Okay, but they could not be with your link, because if not, they will be as a panelist and they will appear with the camera. Okay, so I will remove them. Okay, they need to see. Okay, we are 1 minute left. So Maria Elena, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, I will, Milburn. So start.
Okay, well, good morning, good evening, good day to everybody, wherever you are. Those of us that are on camera are all in different places, so it is a pleasure to have all of you with us, and we thank you above all because of your understanding with the technical difficulties that we encountered in the last session, but we do want to warmly welcome you to this virtual roundtable discussion on digital transformation, elections, and democracy. This is a conversation that we are co-organizing with our partners, the Boston Global Forum and the Michael Dukakis Institute, and of course with our distinguished panelists. This roundtable, today's roundtable, is actually the second in a series of conversations around the broader topic of transatlantic approaches to digital governance and a new social contract in the age of artificial intelligence. This is a topic which will in fact be the theme of a policy lab that we will be organizing in mid-September from the 16th to the 18th of September in the afternoon, European times, and which we hope you will also be able to join. The series of policy discussions all fall within the framework of our work on digital transformation and democracy. And it will also connect with our strategic priority of multilateralism and global cooperation, and our 2020 policy dialogue on multilateralism that delivers. Now, you've noticed that I've used the word policy several times already since I started speaking. And this is because our work, the work of the World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid, is aimed precisely at fostering constructive, positive policy change on issues of global concern. And this from the democratic perspective, or from a democratic perspective, in this case, that of our members, who are all democratically elected former presidents and prime ministers from around the world. They can bring to the consideration of our issues their experience. They bring their individual and collective hands-on experience in dealing with many of the issues that we address and on decision-making and democratic governance, as well as their convening power, their access to today's decision makers, access to today's thought leaders. And they bring their voice and agency to the consideration of today's pressing issues. This is exactly what we will want to do today in this conversation, in this discussion, on a challenge that is very important. Perhaps we feel it all the more today in COVID-19 days, and evidence of this is the fact that we are meeting virtually rather than as we would have hoped face to face. But we will be addressing today this very important topic of digital transformation, elections, and democracy. Two of our members are with us, Joyce Banda, former president of Malawi, and Hanna Suhoksa, former prime minister of Poland. In both of their countries, elections were held in COVID-19 days. We also have Professor Patterson and Professor Rodenberg as well from Harvard, but also very much engaged in the Boston Global Forum's Artificial Intelligence World Society initiative and doing a tremendous amount of work on this topic of artificial intelligence and a new social contract. And we also are very pleased to welcome Alan Doss, former president of the Kofi Annan Foundation, but a former UN civil servant for many years, and somebody who's very experienced and who was president of the Kofi Annan Foundation. In fact, was engaged in the work that the Kofi Annan Foundation undertook on elections, democracy, and technology and digital transformation. So it's a pleasure to have you with us. We're sorry that Yves Leterme, who was with us at our attempt last week to have this discussion, couldn't be with us today, but he does send his regards. It's for personal reasons that he cannot join us. So thank you all very much for being with us. And we look forward to a very interesting next 90 minutes of this discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Tuan?
Tuan, we can't hear you.
Tuan, you're on mute.
Is it hear me? Okay. Thank you, Maria Elena, and thank you all my friends today came join this roundtable. And special thank you World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid is our great partner to co-organizing this AI Society roundtable, the digital technology, democracy, election and democracy in the time COVID-19. So this is a very excellent time, and we follow our very successful event and roundtable AIWS roundtable on May 12. Yeah, we are at that time, we are very exciting and excellent discussion about a new social contract in the age of AI. And we will prepare for September 16 to 18 conference. I think that is a very helpful and very wonderful conference ahead with us between Boston Global Forum and World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid. And also, I think we have a lot of things ahead between Boston Global Forum and World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid. And we think great partner and great fruitful for future. And we trust and believe that the World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid and Boston Global Forum will create contribution for the world, a better world with AI and digital technology. And also, we have thanked Mr. Nguyễn Văn Tưởng and Trầm Hương Khánh Hòa for supporting this event and our work with World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid this year. And he is an excellent innovator and great business leader in Vietnam with noble products. He founded Trầm Hương Khánh Hòa, very innovative business with noble products. And today we are honored to introduce my leaders and thinkers of Michael Dukakis Institute and the Boston Global Forum. First of all, that is my dear friend, Professor Tom Patterson. He is a co-founder of the Boston Global Forum. He is also research director of Michael Dukakis Institute and co-founder of AI Society Innovation Network and co-author of the social contract 2020, a new social contract in the age of AI. He is my dear friend, and he brought me to Harvard in 2011. And the second, my great friend, Mark Rutenberg, he is a world admired and recognized in the world as a great expert in AI and digital policy. And he is a former president and founder of EPIC, is a great organization in digital policy and law in Washington, D.C. After 25 years, great achievement. And now he joined with us as director of Center for AI and Digital Policy. He start, and I hope Mark will continue have great contribution for AI and digital policy in the world in future. Now, Melbourne Live, please chair the AIWS Roundtable, Digital Technology, Election and Democracy on the time of COVID-19. Thank you so much, my dear friend. And I believe we have smoothly event today. No problem with technology more. We are wonderful day today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuan. As Tuan mentioned, my name is Milburn Line. I'm a senior advisor at the World Leadership Alliance Club of Madrid, and it is an honor to help facilitate this roundtable today. And I'm honored to be here with our distinguished guest. At the World Leadership Alliance Club of Madrid, democracy is something we're deeply committed to. All 110 members were democratically elected, invested in both the idea of democracy and the practice of inclusive and participatory democracy. The role of digital technologies and artificial intelligence is increasingly present in almost every facet of today's life, and it merits an in-depth analysis as to how our societies, economies, and polities are being transformed as a result. Today, we focus on a key procedural, substantive, and celebratory aspect of democracy, which is the holding of elections. And yet we cannot ignore another influence at present, which is the global infectious disease pandemic, leading to postponed elections and a series of threats and delays in what we consider normal democratic practice. You've all seen the headlines. Coronavirus kills its first democracy in the Washington Post back a few months ago. The International Crisis Group warning that there's ample room for political leaders to try to exploit COVID-19. I'm a big fan of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, and they've actually set up an observatory to monitor the impact of COVID-19 on democratic practice. And a couple of and in just a moment, when I have a second, I'll put the link up on the chat for all the participants to be able to see. But they on this same website that they've developed from 21 February to 10 August, 69 countries postponed national elections due to the COVID pandemic. But also 52 countries decided to hold national elections despite the pandemic. And we have Club of Madrid members present today from 2 of those countries. So I think we're going to have an exciting kind of reality check, a realistic review of what it's like to conduct elections during a global pandemic. And as mentioned earlier, the pandemic is likely to affect democracy beyond elections. And we want to pick that up. And that's part of this larger process that Maria Elena, our Secretary General, mentioned that leads to the 16th of September. But today we really do want to focus on the procedural aspects of elections. How has COVID impacted that? Burundi had elections, but and these were the first competitive presidential elections since 1993. But because of the quarantine restrictions, no international election observers were present. And so that definitely impacts the quality of democratic practice and the transparency and accountability. But we've also seen other countervailing trends. In South Korea, 66% of voters participated in national elections, highest turnout in 25 years. There were 68% in Poland's election. We're going to get to that in just a second, and 65% in Malawi's election. So in some places, turnout is actually increased or it is strong. And I'd like to begin with that with the actual election experience of World Leadership Alliance Club of Madrid members, because we want to look for the actual trends, the parameters for continued and perhaps transformed elections as we go forward. We have a very distinguished panel today that have been thinking about digitalization, its impact on elections, and if necessary, this idea of a new social contract, how that transforms how citizens relate to their governments and vice versa. But I really want to start with actually the real experience of what's happening. What's happened in the last few weeks. And we're particularly fortunate because we have Her Excellency President Joyce Banda, former president of Malawi. Malawi held elections on 23rd June. And then I'll follow up with Prime Minister Suchocka, and Poland had elections on 12th July. So I'd like to begin and turn to President Banda. Good morning, Your Excellency, and welcome. I'm sorry, you're muted, yes. So can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. That's great. And welcome to the panel. And I was just going to do a quick scene setter. You were the first female head of state in Malawi and the second in Africa. And you've got a tremendous kind of experience in democratic practice. You're a member of Parliament, you were Minister of Gender and Child Welfare, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vice President of Malawi, and then of course, President. And so I wanted to pick up on this experience and get your perspective of how the 23rd June elections, how they came off. Obviously, there was strong turnout, 65%. But did the COVID pandemic, was it a threat? Was the government able to respond effectively? Preventive measures? Were there digital technologies that were employed or should have been employed that could have increased citizen participation? Last week when we spoke about this, you made a very strong case for appropriate technology during elections in Malawi. And so I wanted to pick up on that and see your perspective on the elections in Malawi on June 23rd, please.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank you all for inviting me to this very important discussion. I hope that I can continue participating all the way to September. And last week, what I did I had a well-prepared notes. And with your indulgence, I would like to go through those, so that after my presentation, I will have answered most of the questions that you are raising. And some of the lessons we have learned looking at the Malawi case study. My view is that every citizen has a right to participate in democratic processes, including the right to vote, access to information, for example, manifestos and model of implementation during elections. People have to be aware of registration and verification, polling dates and systems to be used, and all relevant information. The current situation in most African countries is that the majority of the people live in the rural areas and therefore have limited access to information. In the case of Malawi, 85% of the people are not living in urban areas. Number two, most people who have missed out on education are in this category and cannot read and write. In the case of Malawi, 65.7% of the people cannot read and write. So the way they will use information will be different from developed nations. Number three, most of the people in this category, who are in the majority of voters, have no access to digital accessories, making it difficult for them to use digital platforms. And in the case of Malawi, only 27% thereabouts have access. Traditionally, candidates from presidential all the way down to local government elections, aspirants, voters, electoral institutions all depend on door-to-door messaging, radio messaging, television messaging, but largely massless, which means bringing thousands and thousands of people together. There's no other way. So the challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic, the scenarios that I cited earlier, go against all World Health Organization guidelines in the fight against COVID-19. You can't gather in large groups. You have to social distance. You have to use masks. you have to use hygiene in this category of people that are 85% and rural-based. So cancelling of elections as a result of COVID-19 most often will definitely result in more serious conflicts, particularly in Africa and the world as a whole. However, digital transformation may not be attainable right now. I don't know how long we will have to wait. So what needs to be done? In my opinion, in the short term, there must be political will on the part of governments in the third world to find ways of providing gadgets free, such as radios, tablets, phones, to disadvantaged group of their nations. And we've seen that this has happened elsewhere, not for elections, but for education and other purposes. Some governments have provided these gadgets to people. So there must be a deliberate move by governments to intensify civic education to voters through radio and the visual platforms, such as voting rights, voting processes, as well as the World Health Organization guidelines during the pandemic if we have to continue having elections. In the long term, I believe that political will by governments to strengthen democratic and electoral processes as well as governance institutions is also a must. Work on policy that will fix our curriculum to include the computer lessons in our education systems from very early childhood. Because most of our children have not had computer knowledge until they finish their high school. And even college, they haven't touched a computer. In the Western world, a child of 2 years old, 3 years old, by the time the child is 4, is already playing on the computer. So computer lessons should be taught to our children from a very early age. And the governments should have policies that will enable citizens acquire enabling gadgets as well as affordable data charges. It doesn't make sense that in Malawi we are 45% higher than Tanzania and our neighbors in acquiring data that will enable us to communicate. So let me share the Malawi case study and the lessons that we learned. In 2019, Malawi went to the polls. Massive irregularities were recorded. Opposition parties jointly challenged the results in the court. On the 3rd of February 2020, the Constitutional Court nullified the results and called for fresh elections. The ruling party went to court to appeal the loss of the case. A rerun was, and they lost. They lost, and they lost badly. So a rerun was scheduled for the 23rd of June, 2020. This was now in the midst of COVID-19 because our first case, I think, was announced around April. Government tried to avoid a rerun, but the people of Malawi saw a democratic threat of a stolen election and postponed the rerun as more dangerous than COVID-19. So no matter what government said, people did not want to listen. All they wanted was to have a rerun and a corrupt government leave government. So in 2020, Malawi rerun elections came after that Concord ruling. The election hinged on human rights and democratic values of the citizens. The country was at a standstill for 1 year. Every week there were demonstrations until we had to go for that rerun. COVID-19 outbreak came in the picture while the country was in motion towards the 23rd June polling date. The first case, as I said earlier, was announced just 2 months away from the polling date. The government declared a lockdown or a shutdown, or whatever we want to call it, and the civil society went to court to challenge that decision, and they got an injunction, refusing to be restricted, refusing to stay at home. refusing to even wear masks. To start with, they can't afford any masks at all. There was that lack of trust between the people and the government. In their mind, the government was standing in the way because they didn't want the election. But the government, we will never know whether they were genuinely trying to protect the people against the spread of COVID-19. The country received the COVID-19 news over the election fever updates from the government. There were a reach that was generally untrusted by the public due to the reasons why they wanted to challenge the elections in the first place. The elections were set to proceed despite the growing COVID-19 threat and restrictions on public gatherings as imposed by the government. My view is that, one, the general public deserved the right to know the absolute truth about the pandemic without political tones around it. Due to the political posture of COVID-19 in Malawi, the general public disregarded the threat. Number two, people in Malawi saw the democratic threat of a stolen election, as I said earlier, and a postponement of the rerun as more dangerous than COVID-19. Number three, connectivity has become a basic human right. Data is now a commodity consumed by both rural and urban Malawians, as evidenced by the pace at which news and stories about the COVID-19 and the rerun traveled across the country. Fourth, social media had become a public police vehicle. News about rigging or political threats were shared and spread via social media in Malawi. The election was heavily monitored via social media because the police was not standing with the people. Five, Malawi went manual because the preparation of the polls, the rerun of June 23rd, started immediately after the Concord ruling on February 3rd. The Constitution of Malawi had a manual workflow. It was not going to be possible to go absolute digital by 23rd of election. So Malawi had to go manual. Number six, given the level of suspicion and mistrust that existed between the former government, Malawi Electoral Commission, and the general public, any reform to make election electronic was going to be made with public outrage and resistance. So the electoral process under COVID-19, what have we learned? We have learned through this whole process that the basic fundamental is good education of both the public health crisis and basic human rights. None should stamp out the other, but they should coexist. The Malawi case failed because the public felt cheated on COVID-19 information from the start. This mistrust created suspicion against every government move towards managing the emerging public health crisis. What happened is maybe the government would announce that we have found 6 more people that are positive. And straight away on the media, somebody would start a rumor to say those are fake. They just don't want the elections. So secondly, Malawi government used the wrong law in handling the novel crisis. Instead of using the Public Health Act, the government used the Disaster Act, which applied a different meaning to how the forthcoming health crisis was viewed, as a disaster and not as a public health pandemic. Secondly, as information became available to the public about the COVID-19 virus, people started to embrace a new lifestyle with little enforcement, social distancing, hand washing, and face mask wearing. These are happening now because public trust towards government has been restored. So now you find maybe 2/3 of the people using masks because now we have changed government and now government is able to tell people what to do and they will listen. Same applies with changes to political and electoral rights. Public trust is key. Information flow from government and relevant authorities on the changes need to be timed correctly. Changes must apply to the social dynamic of the country and must be relevant and applicable and not copying from other foreign contexts. I feel very sad when I see that some countries just copy and paste. You can't copy and paste. Every country shall be different. Every country shall apply their own ways of fighting COVID-19. We have also learned that all data that flows on public or private infrastructure is subject to manipulation by the owner of the infrastructure, government or private. There is 100% fail-safe approach to digital data transmission from one point to another point. Data transmission creates a black box to the users or customers, and that is a high risk. In aligning with global technological trends, African governments will have to start a digital transformation agenda that begins to shape the digital policy and laws around data handling and transmission to ensure that no government or its agency would have absolute access to the electoral digital data and manipulate it. Again, the issue is trust on the data. Malawi has demonstrated a highly effective manual workflow in the 23rd June 2020 election. It worked very well, and it has been accepted by the people because it was transparent, and the manual data, electoral sheets, and the results were transported from polling stations to districts under intense security watch by our armed forces that are very highly trusted by Malawians. The same arrangement was applied to the data being moved from districts to the National Tally Center. And the Malawians and the Malawi Electoral Commission chair allowed Malawians to have their own teams to follow those tracks, carrying that information to the Tally Center. The people of Malawi were satisfied that no sheet would be tampered with. Because one, the army is trusted by the people. And historically, our army stands with the people here in this country. We can go back 2-3 presidents in the past who were assisted to ascend to power, including myself, with the help of the army. We will recall that when President Bingu Mutharika passed away, and I was vice president, and I was supposed to take oath within 6 hours, according to the law, hold the first meeting. The people in government that were interested in the position stood in the way and tried to stop me until the army general came on the scene and he brought sanity, and he insisted that we should follow the constitution and be allowed to take oath because I had already been elected vice president. So in this time around, the army was trusted by the people. The Electoral Commission was not in charge of the data from end to end. Third parties provided checks and balances, army, police monitors, and public via social media. The social media provided the much needed audit of the results between polling stations and the National Tally Center. The people had tallies before the national tally. By the time the national broadcaster was announcing the national tally, people had already made their own additions and had the exact. There was no discrepancies between the public tally, which used social media technology and aggregate, and the official tally, which was purely manual. The danger is there. The Malawi scenario provides a solution that mixed the manual elements and the technology to produce a result that was widely accepted. Maybe adoption of technology should be gradual in the African context until relevant digital policies and laws are in place. Secondly, increased digital literacy levels amongst the people is critical. People need to understand the basics of data storage, transmission, and the risk of manipulation or loss of data completely. In conclusion, my own take is that, and maybe this may be not relevant, but it's a big lesson that I've shared with most meetings I've been to since our election here in Malawi. is that we need to be aware, and you mentioned that earlier, that some leaders are taking advantage of COVID-19 and the situation to prolong their stay, to compromise democracy, to change laws, because those laws suit them and they allow them to stay on. Some leaders will just declare a state of emergency because they know that the country will look the other way because we are in the midst of COVID-19. But one lesson that I can share with my fellow leaders, those that are aspiring to go to leadership or those that are in State House right now, is to understand that the power has shifted and has shifted forever. Power is in the hands of the people. The younger generation are demanding accountability and transparency. And if we are old-fashioned and are stuck in state houses and thinking that we can be authoritative and oppress our people, leadership is popping up from the marketplace and everywhere. And before you know it, they organize themselves. And if we don't change with time and accept democracy and listen to this other generation, they will bring us down. The Malawi situation has taught us that we must be accountable and transparent and listen to the voices of the people. Thank you.
Brilliant, President Banda. I greatly appreciate that intervention. And I'm not surprised. You've been such an advocate for vulnerable populations, for women and the handicapped. You've tabled a number of issues that I think are central to this discussion today, including the participation of vulnerable populations. But I greatly appreciate how you ended on the possibilities for renewing democracy. And keeping things, returning to that concept of democratic practice and the people's participation, even in contested spaces where politics and procedures are mixing and impacting each other. And I think you've tabled a number of issues. We'll get back to that in the discussion. I have the privilege of announcing a quick poll to consult the people that are actually watching right now out in the webosphere. If elections were held in your country at this time, would you go to vote in spite of the COVID-19 risks? It's a yes or no, and I'll announce the findings once we get back to this. I'd like to turn to the elections in Poland. We have the benefit of having Prime Minister Suchocka with us today. And Poland was the first European Union country to hold presidential elections in the times of the pandemic, with a 68% turnout in the second round on 12 July. And I wanted to ask you specifically, how did the pandemic impact the elections in terms of electoral campaigns, electoral observation, which we mentioned earlier, and the election day itself? My understanding is that much of the electoral campaign process was conducted online through the internet, and that reflected a lot of some of the benefits we think of in terms of accessibility, but some of the negatives we think in terms of what President Banda mentioned in terms of social media, attack media, this business about fake news and disinformation. So from your perspective, what was the impact of technology on this very specific electoral process, Prime Minister?
Thank you for inviting me to take part in the meeting, because exactly it was one of the crucial decisions in Poland concerning elections in a very difficult time. And I can say that the Polish society was very strongly divided as concern the decision to make election in time of pandemic, because exactly it was the constitutional solution that the election should be held in May, because the election should be organized the period of the acting president. The President Duda ended his mandate on 6th of August. So for that reason, the election should be taken in May. But we have in our constitution a clear solution concerning the state of emergency. And there is a clearly regulated that we have a special state of emergency, which could be could be announced because of natural disaster. And it was the situation of natural disaster. So many specialists in constitutional law, many activists, even ombudsman, commissioner on human rights, they ask the government to organize, to declare the state of emergency. And then the situation would be clear, because in the constitution there's a very clear rule. The election should not be organized in the time of state of emergency and 90 years after the date of the end of state of emergency. So it is a very clear solution because of our history. When we had a problem with state of emergency in the 80s, now we have a very good solution in the constitution. But the government decided, the government had, as usual, two options: constitutional option, or second one, purely political one. The constitutional option was exactly based on the state of emergency, and then to make, how to say, the roadmap, how to prepare the future election, even taking into account the new technologies. And then the second solution was to adopt the purely political solution and organize elections in a pandemic situation without sufficient weapons important for making elections. Because in our electoral law, we have only provisions concerning the normal classic voting, no electronic voting, no possibility to make electronic voting, and then only partially by partially using the postal voting. So we were completely unprepared for making election in the time of pandemia and in the time of lockdown, and as President rightly said, shutdown. Yes, how we can organize the electoral campaign when everything was, how to say, prohibited. The public space was prohibited, the public meetings were prohibited, and the gathering were prohibited. So there was no possibility to organize electoral campaign in a normal way. The only weapon was social media, and social media was exactly used in very active way. But it was not the best solution for making elections, because everybody said that the electoral campaign was not the just electoral campaign. And then we have exactly taking into account this situation, the purely political situation, when the government rejected the constitutional solution, then the government looked for, I don't know how to say, for making the elections in a very, very critical situation. First of all, decided to organize election on 10th of May. 10th of May, but 10th of May, it was just a peak of a pandemia and nobody was prepared. And 6th of April, Polish parliament adopted in a very quick way, on one day, new law, electoral law, amendment to electoral law, when introduced the postal voting, only postal voting. But you know, it was April, 6th April, election should be held on 10th of May. And new law was adopted months before the election, and no technical, how to say, technical solution were prepared for making the postal voting. Because when everything is closed, postal offices are closed, how the situation should be organized? Who will make the card for voting? Who will distribute the card? How the card will be, how to say, distributed between people, voters. So it was a very strong discussion and very strange, because we have candidates. The candidates tried to make an electoral campaign in month April, and the date of election on 10 May were decided. Yes, but in the meantime, it was such a political atmosphere, social atmosphere, that it is impossible to have elections on 10th of May. And what then happens? One of candidates from the opposition party declare that she will not take part in this campaign because it is not a just electoral campaign. But finally, till the end, she was in the game, but everybody was a little astonished. What this means? Yes, she is still candidate or not a candidate. And then it was clearly said by the Electoral Commission that Electoral Commission is not able to prepare all the documentations, etc., for 10th of May. And finally, we have such a situation that the election on 10th of May were, ordered, but not organized. And 10th of May, the voting points were closed, and nobody came, nobody organized the election of 10th of May. And then the government looked for the new term till the end of May to organize the election, but it was completely impossible. So for that reason, they tried to make a political agreement between political parties and to find a new date for election. But in opinions of many constitutional lawyers, it was out of the constitution, out of the provision of the constitution to organize elections in June. But finally, the political parties agreed and decided to make election on 28th of June and the second turn of 12th of July. But, it is exactly very strange what the Electoral Commission declared concerning the date of 10th of May, because State Election Commission issued a resolution in which it interpreted that the lack of possibility to vote for candidates on 10th of May was tantamount to the situation of lack of candidates. So it will be up to the Speaker of the Sejm to call new elections. But it was a very strange situation because there were 10 candidates. They tried to make electoral campaign, and finally, Electoral Commission decided that they were no candidates for election. And finally, Speaker of the Sejm decided to the date of the next election on 28th June, and on 2nd June, the new law, amendment to the law has been passed, where it has been declared, regulated that there will be a normal election in classic election with possibility to use the postal voting, but no possibility to use electronic voting because it was impossible to organize and to prepare solutions in such a short term for electronic voting. So for that reason, I repeat it again, that the proposals and the demand of constitutional lawyers, ombudsman, OSCE, and other institutions to declare the state of emergency could create the better situation for elaborating a new law with possibility to have an electronic voting, because otherwise it was completely impossible. Everybody should go to the normal, pool office, I can say, or maybe using post, but post was not used very, very frequently. Everybody, majority, went to the normal voting with all the security reasons, mask, etc., long queue, waiting in the long queue. And finally, the participation in such a situation was exactly very high, because it was one of the highest in our 30 years history when the people went to the voting. But it was so because the society was so strongly divided, as concerns the making elections and also as concerns the candidates. So for that reason, the participation in the election was so high. But the result we know, yes, it was only very small difference between two candidates, but no possibility, no using of electronic voting, but only social media. And the electoral campaign mostly has been done by social media. So in this sense, social media played very, very important role, because one of candidates, the acting president, he has been supported by the government, and he had such a, how to say, support to make a normal election. And other, no. I don't know what has happened. What has happened?
We can hear you. We can hear you, Prime Minister.
Yes, but I haven't here because I had such a, how to say, break, very strong.
Yeah, there was a noise, but it's gone now.
Yes, probably somebody from the second part, yes, in our divided country decided to do it. So, but I only would like to say what is the situation. And then after a result of election, it was how many, I would like only to say you that when the Supreme Court and Electoral Commission and then Electoral Commission declared the result of election and said that the election were valid, there were sent about 5,000 or 8,000 protests to the Supreme Court. 5,000, almost 6,000 protests to the Supreme Court. And finally, the Supreme Court considered only 93 protests to be justified, but finally said that election were valid, and then the protest had no influence for the further course of election. And this is now the situation. We have a new president since last week, but the society is still divided. But I think that all the situation gave a very good ground for deeper discussion concerning the new amendments to electoral law, especially how to organize the law with using the artificial intelligence, e-voting and other instruments. Because young people, they prefer this kind of voting, yes, but it was no possibility, and for the moment we are not prepared to adopt such a law because it should be, how to say, done in a very just way, not in very rush procedure, but in very normal, long parliamentary procedure to guarantee all the rights in electoral process. So I would like only to say it was longer, but exactly it was a very, very difficult problem, and it's still for us very, very difficult problem.
Brilliant, Prime Minister. I think you've sketched out a yet even deeper case study on Poland, and some of these issues have resonated with the Malawi case of conducting elections in incredibly contested spaces, not just kind of normal transitional democracies, but when kind of democracy is on the ballot in a sense, where you have questions of legitimacy and social trust in highly divided, polarized societies, and that's obviously a complicating factor. And then you throw a pandemic on top of that, in which certain leaders are taking advantage of it. This kind of autocratic power grab, it's called. And then when you have institutions that aren't functioning, so you try to do a postal election balloting when the post offices are closed. And so I think this is really, really important. I wonder if our poll has come in, because I'd like to see what our participants have said about whether they would go to and this is interesting. 86% of people said they would go to vote in times in spite of the COVID risk. Only 14% said no. And this is quite inspiring and interesting that people are willing to take risk for their belief in political participation. I think this is incredibly important. I'm going to turn to Mr. Doss now. But before I do so, Mr. Doss, allow me please to just, we want to keep this interactive with our audience, and I want to ask another poll question, and because it's related to some of the things that have come up in terms of digital participation. And the question for our audience is, do you think that the implementation of digital tools favors citizen participation? And you've heard the kind of the back and forth on this. There's pros and cons. There's the digital divide and gaps in coverage, and there's also the manipulation of digital tools for disinformation and the kind of the downside of social media. But there's also these advantages to potential access, and of course both panelists, both Club of Madrid members have pointed out that youth are deeply vested in digital processes, and that's one way to access new populations. So turning to Mr. Doss, you are the president of the Kofi Annan Foundation, and I highly, highly recommend all our viewers who haven't found it, and I'm going to actually put it on the chat right now, that they access your report from early this year, right before the pandemic began. You had a commission that was inspired by Mr. Annan himself, and studied, the title was the Commission on Elections in the Digital Age. Seminal findings. I can't recommend this highly enough for everybody involved, but I wonder if those have been colored, if they've been changed, those findings, because of these scenarios that we're now hearing about in Poland and Malawi, and of course in other places. Your recommendations were, I was reading them last night, and I remember thinking, all of these things are still relevant, but I wonder, have they changed? You have sections on how the necessity of building capacity, strengthening norms, and I think both of our Club of Madrid members have mentioned that. Going back to civic education, and then specific actions by public authorities and platforms. But has this changed in the current context of a global pandemic?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. And I found the presentations by my two previous speakers, President and Prime Minister, very informative, and indeed underline some of the things that we found and wrote about in our report. There was if you will, case studies, but they add a very important element of reality to what we wrote and which we examined in that report. Just briefly to say, I mean, Milburn has said, are the findings and recommendations still relevant? Well, the report came out literally within a week or two of the pandemic exploding on us. But as I will explain, I think both the findings and the recommendations are still highly relevant, although might be expanded in some areas to take account now of the experience, that some of which has just been described to us. So a few words, if you will, on some of the key findings, a mention then of recommendations, and perhaps wind up with a couple of conclusions about how the electoral environment and technology and COVID are interacting, and are they coming together, or are we simply creating additional problems? First, on key findings, I think the most important one, but by no means the only one, and which again I think has been illustrated in a way by the recent Polish and Malawi experiences, is that the countries that are most vulnerable, if you will, to digital distortion are those where polarization is already at a very high level. We found that the incidence of social media, particularly, doesn't create those tensions. They are there already. There's pre-existing polarization, usually at a very high level, and not just in the global south. What we're seeing right now in the United States is an illustration of that, I think. And because of that, these countries have low levels of trust. There's a declining level of trust or no trust in authorities. The media are seen as being highly partisan. And much of what is published, indeed, in the mainstream media is then taken over and amplified and exacerbated by some of the social media, and particularly those platforms that are seen to thrive on or diffuse extreme views. So I think it's very important to recognize that technology, and particularly the digital technology and the growth of social media, have not created these problems. What they have done, of course, is amplified them to many degrees in many instances. But we also were able to point out that there have been positive aspects. Some of these have just been mentioned for electoral management and electoral democracy. Clearly, social media monitoring can be very helpful. It does allow access to a much wider range of actors, including young people who use these technologies in the way that we used to pick up paperbacks. They now pick up their mobiles and use it in the same way. Also, things like it's much easier for small parties, political parties, to get started now using social media. And also crowdfunding has been a major change in the way money is raised. And given that party political financing is always an area of considerable controversy and indeed worry that big donors are subverting the electoral or democratic process. Crowdfunding actually has, through social media, has provided a viable alternative for smaller parties. And it was interesting yesterday evening in the announcement of the new vice presidential nomination of the Democratic Party, Mr. Biden mentioned in particular how much money they'd raised over the previous 24 hours through crowdfunding on the internet. So there are positive aspects. The electoral management aspect also, I mean, in terms of the technology you need, I mean, there are some doubts, and there are serious doubts about how far you can go with technology on electoral management, in particular in the collation, dissemination or analysis of voting patterns. But in certain circumstances, we've seen actually technology or the digitalization of some of the electoral processes has been very useful and constructive. I remember a conversation with the former head of the Nigerian electoral management body who told me that the digitization of the registration process had actually increased very considerably the confidence and indeed the credibility of the electoral process in Nigeria, which, as you know, is a huge and very diverse country. So those are some, just a smattering of the key findings. On the recommendations, again, I think these will now be familiar from various interventions by different organizations. The Commission strongly recommended the regulation of political advertising, and that it should not be left exclusively to the platforms. There needs to be codes, that has to be agreed, but nevertheless, it's important that this become a general standard based on agreement by political actors, but also by social society, by civil society. Second, the platforms need to strengthen their ability quite dramatically and rapidly, and they are moving in that direction, I have to say, on the whole issue of disinformation and hate speech. I was fortunate to join Kofi Annan when he was leading a very important commission for Myanmar in the situation in the Rakhine province, where, as you know, the Muslim population has been come under a great deal of attack, and we were trying to diffuse the situation. And we were staggered when we discovered how influential Facebook was in Myanmar. 70% of the population had access to Facebook, not to national newspapers, not to national television. And sadly, up to that point, it was being misused for the dissemination of anti-Muslim sentiments by extremists. And Facebook was not happy, but recognized the problem and has now taken steps to increase its surveillance of its own website. So that's a big issue, and I think for many countries that the platforms need to move forward more rapidly. Third key recommendation is electoral management bodies need to be strengthened and made autonomous, especially in the global south, where they are often, too often, frankly, under the thumb of the administration in power. I think that's really important, but they also need to boost their capabilities in the whole digital area to be able to better monitor what's happening, but also to supervise where you do get into electronic aspects of the voting process, that they can handle it properly and not just buy expensive electoral technology off the shelf. We've seen cases of this most recently in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where millions of dollars were spent, and quite frankly, with very, very disappointing, some would say even fraudulent results. So that's another issue which I think we have to look at, where digital technology there can be very helpful, but there are limits and it needs very careful oversight. Finally, a couple of other points. Foreign engagement in elections. This has gone to a new level because of social media and digital technology. Governments have always interfered, to be very honest, in other people's elections, but they have not been able to do it at the scale and in the intensity and the speed with which the internet is now provided, you know, through bots, trolls, and all the other techniques. So again, we strongly recommend it through coalitions of the willing, OECD, the European Union, and so forth, which has already gone down that road to some extent. We must develop codes of conduct, codes of engagement to try to limit. We won't be able to eliminate it, but at least to reduce and control foreign interference, frankly, in elections, which is subversive and which is not transparent. Finally, academic access to the platforms and their data. They've been very jealous about guarding this, not allowing in very much access, and I think that needs to change. Obviously, it can't be open field, open But nevertheless, I think it would be important to find out how the platforms and changing, for example, their algorithms, what influence can that have? How can that impact electoral behavior, electoral performance, electoral outcomes? This is still very much unknown. And I think we should arrange, and they should be part of the arrangement with the platforms, that they need to give more access to accredited, responsible researchers from the academic world. So finally, just to conclude, how have we seen the electoral environment, technology and COVID coming together or not, as the case may be? Actually, earlier this year, the Foundation, with a group of like-minded organizations, published an open letter, which you'll find on our website, if I can do some promotion, which drew attention to the dangers of what COVID would bring in terms of the points that, again, my two previous speakers have emphasized. You know, the danger that polling dates, postponement, cancellation could be manipulated and is being manipulated, we know that. The danger that decisions would be made outside of the rule of law without reference to constitutions or electoral laws, and that they would be done in a unilateral fashion for political interest. And we emphasize the importance. If changes like this are to be made, they need to be done by general consensus. They can't be just done by the stroke of the pen by the incumbent. That is very dangerous and will often backfire to the disadvantage of the country and to the rule of law. But above all, they deepen distrust. I emphasized at the outset that one of the findings of the Commission was that the countries where trust is low in the political system are the most at risk in what's happening. And this just deepens distrust. If a government of the day, fearing defeat or fearing that the pandemic and the way it's being handled will disfavor their electoral chances, then start doing things unilaterally or in a very covert manner, then that will simply deepen distrust and will further, I think, create further tensions in society, which the risk is that they then boil over at the time of the elections, and the election outcome is not considered to be legitimate. Without legitimacy, there's no real democracy or good governance. So I think those are some of the key points I wanted to make. But you know, to sum up in a way, the pandemic was obviously not created by digital technology. But I think we have to be very clear that the misuse of technology will exacerbate in the electoral context, including particularly social media, will exacerbate the enormous challenges that electoral democracy faces in consequence of the pandemic, where government authority, credibility is being increasingly questioned, including, as you know, in very well-established democracies. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak today.
Brilliant, Mr. Doss. I think that's incredibly helpful. And again, I recommend that everyone have a look at the report for a tremendous amount of nuance, detail. And Mr. Doss has brought us around to the heart of the issues. I'd like to announce our poll, as I mentioned, the heart of the issue, because and I have to say goodbye to President Banda. She's going to have to leave us, and we greatly appreciate your participation. And I'm sorry we're not going to get to the discussion. We're going to turn to that in just a few minutes. Thank you to President Banda. The second poll question is: do you think the implementation of digital tools favors citizen participation, despite President Banda's and I think Prime Minister Suhotska's nuanced version of how it's a double-edged sword? 88% of our viewers are convinced that digital tools do favor citizen participation. And I want to turn to our expert, Professor Patterson, who's written on this idea of a new social contract. The idea that, as Kofi Annan said for the Commission report, that kind of the marching orders were technology does not stand still and neither does democracy. And we're seeing that happen, right? And we're seeing countries and constituents demand electoral polling even despite the risk. And we're seeing younger generations expressing interest in digital access. So is this redefining what we think of as a social contract for democracy? Are we getting a new version of democracy, 2.0 it's been called? Professor Patterson, and I know I'm asking you to reshape the world in 5 minutes, but hopefully you can give us some ideas, and then we'll go to Professor Mark Rotenberg and then have a couple of questions before we have to sign off.
Yeah, just to to save a bit of time, let me focus in on online voting. You know, I think President Banda mentioned one of the obstacles to the widespread use, and that's digital access. That's a huge problem in the third world, but it's also a problem in some first world countries. In the United States, we have close to 90% digital access, but there are places, mostly rural, mostly poor, where the access is below 60%. So, but I want to talk a little bit about a second obstacle. 2 years ago, our National Academy of Sciences looked at the possibility of online voting, looked at it deeply, and concluded that it's too risky at this point, that there's not enough security surrounding it, too vulnerable to hacking. All of those things would really undermine legitimacy if it occurred. And so they recommended against it. And you know, I think as long as that's the case, it's almost too early to begin pushing this idea, because I do think, in addition to the kind of voices we could expect to oppose it for partisan political reasons, there'd be a lot of authoritative voices that would be cautioning against this kind of movement. And the problem becomes when both sets of voices come together, you're going to have a fairly large number of people who are going to conclude that it's too risky. And once they get to that point, boy, then it's really hard to bring them back at a point where you'd like them to consider that possibility. You know, we see that in the United States around a lot of issues, partly for reasons that have already been talked about, but there's so much disinformation out there. We now have a huge kind of anti-vaccine constituency in this country. And there's some worry even when we get a vaccine that it's going to be hard to get to herd immunity, because there's going to be a percentage of the population that's going to refuse vaccination. So, you know, once these attitudes get worked into the public, they're really hard to get out. And if people believe that online voting is unsafe, then we've got a real problem on our hands. So once we have a system, I think there's still going to be problems getting buy-in on the part of the public, and for reasons that have been talked about. This is not a very favorable environment to sell changes or to convince people about the importance of changes in the political process. You know, if we had high trust in government, and if we had high social trust, you know, that's when you want to make change. And we don't have either one of those at the moment. And it really opens the door to disinformation, but even more to receptivity to that disinformation. So I think we've got to go a little bit slowly on this notion of online voting. I think we have to put a couple of things in place. One, I think we have to create secure systems for online voting. I mean, that's a technological problem, and we're not quite there yet, but we need to get there. Then I think we need to start talking about it just generally. Begin the educational process, not in the sense of immediate implementation, but getting people accustomed to the idea and the benefits of it. And there really are substantial benefits to online voting. And that's the educational problem. And then I think cases are important. I think there are countries where this can work now, and they're most likely kind of smaller democracies in a large democracy like the United States. We have a very complex electoral system. It would be very hard to implement online voting in our system in any sort of systematic way. But test cases where we basically see the advantages, discover the weaknesses, they can serve a real purpose in terms of being able to kind of advance in the long run a particular idea. We've seen that, for example, in the United States around mail-in voting. Oregon has been doing it for quite a long time now. And, you know, when the arguments came up in the United States about the need to go to more mail-in voting because of COVID, you know, there's a partisan pushback on that. One of the best sources of evidence against that argument is Oregon's experience with mail-in voting. They've been doing it for a long time, and the rate of fraud in that system, is something about on the order of about 1 in 10 million ballots cast as a fraudulent ballot. So that can be done safely. There's a point where online voting can be done safely. And I think if we work into this slowly, cautiously, get those test cases out there, when it comes to adopting it on a more widespread level, we'll have in place the things that we need to get the kind of buy-in and get people to understand this is a legitimate way to conduct elections.
Excellent, Professor Patterson. I think this is really important because you've raised an issue of trust in the system, and digitalization is at the heart of that. And of course, we're at a very sensitive time. Despite the fact that our audience is convinced that we should be moving towards digitalization, I think that your expert doubts help us shape this. And I wonder if there's a chance that we could think about piloting in local elections and seeing how digital processes work and internet-based voting could work in maybe local elections in places like the United States and other places. And I want to turn to Mark Rotenberg on this because we've talked briefly about this, and you've got a kind of a rich layout here. And I wonder, and again in 5 minutes because we do want to bring in some questions at the end. Is it, where are we with this? Is there enough trust in the system to move forward on internet-based digital technologies and elections without compromising or the potential perception and manipulation of the perception of compromised electoral rights?
Great. Well, thank you. And I just wanted to begin by saying that I thought many of the comments made by the speakers earlier are exactly on point to understanding the challenge we face. President Bondo's remark about how in some circumstances technology may be the solution, but in other circumstances, we look to manual solutions, I think is very much in the back of the minds of people who look at the issue of election security. Tom Patterson mentioned the report of the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years ago, which we were actually involved with. And one of the conclusions from that report is that as you move from the world of paper ballots, which you can verify literally by counting, to a purely digital online voting environment, you actually lose some of the mechanisms, for example, of auditing that are necessary to ensure trust in election outcomes. And I think this also begins to provide an answer based on some of the intermediate solutions that governments are looking at. For example, mail-in ballots have the characteristic of providing a paper record that enables auditing, but also respects some of the unique challenges we face today during a pandemic, where there is concern that voter participation at polling places, physical polling places, may be diminished. So that's one way to understand how we can combine the traditional advantage of the paper ballot with some of the unique challenges we face today. This is true also, by the way, even in the voting machines that are being used, such as the scanner machines that can take a paper ballot, scan it rapidly, produce a digital tally that can be reported, but also maintain the paper ballot so that a post-election audit becomes possible. Again, this is an intermediate solution that provides some benefit enabled by technology and also preserves auditability. There's one other issue I wanted to raise in this context, and it's a little bit subtle, but I think it should be on the minds of leaders of democratic governments, and that is that our modern understanding of the right to vote requires not only an assurance that people can equally participate and the roles of political parties are fairly respected, but also that when people cast their ballot, that is a secret ballot, and that others, their employers or their relatives or their neighbors, can't compel a person to reveal who they're voting for. And I think we understand why in democracies, the ability to vote privately for a candidate or a referendum, which may not be a popular position is nonetheless a vital right to maintain the vibrancy of democratic governance. And this is also an additional challenge to online voting systems. So when you begin to look closely at the process of collecting votes and tabulating votes, again, when we move from the realm of the paper ballot dropped into the box to a circumstance where someone is asked to open a web browser and type in the candidate they support, almost immediately, I think we have to ask the question, will there be an assurance that that person's vote will be tabulated without the requirement that the person's identity be known? So this is one of the other challenges, I think, associated with online electronic voting. But again, to pick up on some of the comments of the earlier speakers, I don't think this is a reason that we can't use the internet to promote voter participation, to provide clear guidance about steps that are being taken to address public health concerns, so that people who do go to physical polls have the information they need to participate with trust and confidence. But I think when we get up to the point where we begin to talk about the tabulation of votes in an electronic environment, we need to be aware that there are many, many risks. Systems can fail. There can be adversarial attacks, not only domestically by a political party or criminal enterprise, but also by a foreign adversary, which could obviously seek to destabilize a democratic government simply by calling into question the reliability of electronically tabulated vote. And final point which I'll make, I was sharing this with Milburn in our pre-conference conversation. With electronic systems, there is also the risk of a global failure that can be far more problematic than when a single system fails. So for example, a voting machine can fail if it runs on electricity and someone accidentally knocks out the plug. That happens. But when voting systems are networked together and the network fails or is compromised or is attacked, then all of the systems on the network fail. And that risk of global failure almost necessarily magnifies the consequence of the decision to move to online voting. I had this personal experience recently. I was playing in a chess tournament in the United States. It was a tournament that had in the past taken place in a physical location. We'd all fly off to some city and sit in a hotel conference room for a couple of days. This year, they decided to organize it on the internet, as many chess tournaments are done now, mostly with success. We get to the final round, the championship round. Everyone is remarking on how well things are going, how very smoothly the tournament is operating. And twice during the final round, the server on which all the games are taking place goes down. And you just have to imagine chess players who don't deal with adversity particularly well, looking at a blank screen on their computer. And I thought to myself, my goodness, if I were an election official, you know, the night of the votes, waiting for the votes to be reported, and suddenly everything went down simultaneously, I imagine it would not be a good evening. So a point to keep in mind as we look at what technology can and cannot do to enable participation in democratic elections.
Excellent point, Mark. And that's exactly what happened to us last week with this platform. And so the glitches occur, and we have to keep that in mind. And those, when we're deeply vested in questions of trust and legitimacy, it's just, it can't be overstated how fragile a digital technology could actually be. And I want to go back really quickly to perceptions. And I want to point out that Mr. Rotenberg is a very honest person, because in the conversation, he revealed that he actually lost the chess match. And so I asked him, because of the digital glitch, you actually had a chance to protest and ask for a rematch, even though you knew you had lost. And he did not do so. I'm not sure most political parties would follow that line, but it is illustrative. So we only have about 10 minutes left. left, and I want to make sure we respect some of the questions that have come in. So what I'm going to try to do is amalgamate the questions and give everybody a 1 to 2 minute reflection based on the questions. And the questions point out a variety of things. One, a lot about this trust issue, one about the digital gap, that only 10% of people in Africa have access to the internet, for example. And then they lead us to other places as well. And I wondered, what I want to do is, in this context of risk, fragility, digital gaps, but also our audience is convinced that digitalization does create access. How do you move forward? And are some of the solutions local? And are some of the solutions multilateral, standard setting? The Annan report points out that the Abuja Accord on Code of Conduct of Candidates was key in Nigeria. It's come up in the conversation. The European Commission has emitted standards, and of course, everyone is trying to regulate these virtual social media platforms. So where is that balance of risk and access, and creating a new social contract in which people feel vested in, even more vested in their democracy? Can I start with you, Prime Minister?
I don't know. You are on mute, by host. Okay. Okay. So that's exactly very interesting, the discussion. You know, I am now, we are exactly now strongly discussing the issue of e-voting, taking into account our last experience. And also because, as you know, I was for many years member of the Venice Commission. Venice Commission prepared some guidelines concerning e-voting. But we discuss here today that there are, of course, a different situation in different parts of our globe. And it's a different situation in Europe, European countries, and in African countries. So I would like to exactly ask the question, it is possible to discuss, to have European standard on e-voting. What should be done when we would like to discuss on such a European standard, which should be a kind of model for other countries to follow? What conditions should be fulfilled? And of course, the Venice Commission put it to the code of conduct in the electoral matter, but then also Venice Commission made such an overview of the different decisions and opinions of Venice Commission concerning just the electronic voting. And I think that then we can find very interesting questions, but not always a good answers, yes, because answers are much more difficult. You also put the answer to me. It's difficult to answer clearly where are the risks and where are the, how to say, positive results. I am of the opinion that speaking not as a politician but as a lawyer, we have to exactly make a very good draft looking for the good guidelines, how to avoid risk. But sometimes we can avoid the risk in our draft law, but in practice, in politics, sometimes our very good guarantees are taken as an advantage for making disaster. And this, it is a problem, but it's not, it does not should stop us not to make such a, how to say, not to take such an effort. And we exactly have to prepare, taking into account the guidelines of the Venice Commission, but also the Council of Ministers of the Council of Europe, recommendations concerning the legal, operational and technical standards for e-voting. It is a very good document which exactly pointed out all the important elements for the future voting as a standard for others. Because I am strongly convinced that we will not avoid electronic voting in the future. Probably it is now such a tension. And even in Poland, in 2011, I read such a public opinion poll, and it was about 87% of people, they were in favor of a different kind of electronic voting. Yes, So it was a very high percentage of people they would like to vote, but probably they were younger people, but not all the society, because our society, as I said, also is very divided, and probably the old people, they are not so happy to go to vote by electronic means. So
Thank you, Prime Minister. This is so important. Mr. Doss?
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. Particularly, I didn't dwell much on online voting. I certainly agree it raises important issues, and countries I've worked in clearly were not ready for it. And it doesn't, but I think there's a balance of risks here. First of all, because online voting, in terms of just pressing the button and then the rest is all configured, is only part of the picture, because a lot of electoral related processes now are being digitized. I mentioned registration, but also the collection of paper ballots and then put into a digital form and then transmitted to the regional center, and from there to the central electoral authority. That happens a lot. And the fact that we now have these voting machines that allow a digital vote, but also permit a paper trail, is a reassurance. So I think depending on the country and the technology and the access, all of these issues, but paper ballots alone are not an answer either, because we know lots and lots of cases where ballot boxes are stuffed, boxes disappear, and so forth. So I think we have to get the balance right here. But I do agree that for the time being, 100% online voting is not feasible, nor I think people would feel comfortable about it. I mean, just 2 or 3 years ago, the Netherlands went back to paper voting, actually, because they were worried about intrusion from overseas, by the way. I think that was the concern there. Just on one other point, and that is Africa. I think Professor Patterson or Professor Rothenberg mentioned only 10% have access to the internet, but that hides a much more important figure, which is the access through mobile telephony to services. And that's well over 50%. And having lived in some pretty isolated places in Africa, I can assure you the internet is getting everywhere. It's getting everywhere. In fact, in some areas, it's going faster. Payments, all kinds of things. I mean, look at Kenya. Look at even, frankly, some of the most countries that have most difficulties, like the DRC. People are buying into digital. You can rent a phone. You can rent a phone for 15 minutes and access a website. Now, obviously, that's not for online voting, but it is moving that way. And young people are clearly, if we want to engage young people, because they don't vote, if we want to get them to involve in politics and in using their democratic rights, then clearly we have to use digital techniques, even if it isn't direct online voting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Doss. Professor Patterson.
Yeah, I mean, Africa is an interesting test case, and within 10 years, because of the satellites that are going up at a rapid pace, I think you'll have a signal anywhere in Africa, so that if you have the phone, you'll be able to participate in the digital age. I think we just need to move quickly on in those areas where the benefits are clear. Digitizing registration really makes it more accurate, easier, up to date. Terrific tool for election monitoring, and then go slow in those areas where the risks are higher. And obviously, the point of greatest risk is online voting. And I think there is some merit in thinking locally about that particular risk to work out some of the problems at that level. It's also the case if we can develop some sophisticated systems. Sometimes going local can be a major protection. We see that around mail-in voting in the US. These ballots take different forms in different places in the US. And some worry that some outside actor or internal actor could really duplicate mail-in ballots and flood the mail with faulty ballots. It's almost impossible to do because of the decentralized nature of that system. So I think that's the area where the work needs to be done, but where in the long run, there's great promise.
Thank you, Professor. And Mark, you get the last word, and then I'll say I'll send this off once you finish.
Great, thank you. Just a couple of brief points. First of all, I agree with Mr. Doss. Clearly, technology has a very important role to promote public participation in elections and to enable administration of elections. And of course, that's should be encouraged. I think in my remarks, I was simply pointing to the specific problem of vote tabulation, which tends to be a weak link as we think about online voting, and also the need to maintain the secret ballot, which is a related democratic value. But also to say that we shouldn't think only in terms of vote tabulation. You know, I remember back in January of 2017, when the US intelligence community published its report on the attack on the US elections in 2016. And the phrase that stuck in my mind, used by the Director of National Intelligence, was this was a multi-pronged attack. And what the agencies were describing was not simply the problem of trying to alter the outcome of an election, but actually to destabilize the infrastructure of the democratic electoral process through, for example, disinformation. And I think we also need, as we go forward, trying to engage young people in taking advantage of new technologies, recognize as well the likelihood that there are new threats out there, and there are people who do not necessarily share a commitment to the success of democratic elections. And I think it would be wise to anticipate some of those risks and to build in resiliency, which is a popular term, build in resiliency into these processes as we move forward.
Great, very important points. To close, I would like to thank all our Club of Madrid members. I'm really sorry for President Banda didn't have a chance to give us a summary statement. Thank Prime Minister Suchocka, our panelists, Professor Patterson, Mark, Mr. Doss. If you enjoyed our conversation today and you learned something, please join us on 16 September for Transatlantic Approaches on Digital Governance, a new social contract in the age of artificial intelligence, where we'll be looking at best practices and come up with policy recommendations that come out of this entire process. I don't think I'm going to have a concluding statement because this is a process that's going to go forward, and we've learned a lot today. On one side, I'm daunted by the risk, and you've laid those risks out very clearly in real elections, and then of course in our analysis. But I'm also inspired by how we have come back to this idea of people's commitment to participation and to a democratic practice, and the turnouts are evidence of this. And the idea of local piloting versus setting standards, or in complement with setting standards, is potentially the way forward in terms of policy recommendations. So I'm inspired that we've kind of come round robin to the idea that technology is a tool that is vested or is connected. It converges with the conceptual questions of democracy, but it has brought us around to the very conceptual questions of democracy and how we create democracies that are more responsive to these younger populations that believe in technology. Prime Minister Suchocka made a really important point at the end that I don't want us to forget. We are path dependent on technology. The technology is moving forward. Kofi Annan said it as the marching orders for the commission. Young people want it. 88% of our viewers believe that it creates greater access. So finding that balance of making sure that the risks are weighed and addressed and made explicit may be part of the key to going forward. Thank you all. Thank you, Boston Global Forum. And please look for us on the 16th to the 18th of September for the culminating event. And after we sign off here, you're going to get a questionnaire. We hope everyone will fill that in so that we can do this better the next time. Thanks again.